If we think of two people who, if they encountered each other at a certain time in the lives of both of them, would have been extreme enemies, even fought to the death, it would be Peter and Paul. Imagine the arrest of Jesus. Paul, at that point, was someone who despised Christianity, and after the resurrection of Jesus, when Christianity was spread throughout the Middle East, Paul was one of those who believed in A, persecuting Christians, and B, killing them. And he was an accessory to the murder of St. Stephen. Peter, at the arrest of Jesus, pulls out his sword and cuts off the high priest's ear in a way to protest and to fight in defense of Jesus. If you imagine those two together at that particular point, although we have no record that Paul was ever near where Jesus was arrested, but if he was, you could imagine two people that would have happily fought to the death. But Jesus was the one who teaches both of them about himself and leads them both to a conversion where not only do they not become people who would kill each other, they end up being martyred for teaching about the one Jesus that they both encountered. And so that recognizes and teaches about the power of Jesus. But what it also shows us is their respective teaching. St. Paul taught that the more that we embraced Christ and lived the gospel, the less that we needed to be under the law. And so Paul actually rejects the law that we find in ancient Judaism. And he calls Christianity what it is, the new covenant. And so we don't live under the Judaic law because of Paul. Paul made it very clear, you do not do this. But we live under the law of Christ. So that means that the law goes from being externally driving us to being internally driving us. What that translates to is something that we deal with in our society today. The more that our rules and regulations are within us instead of forced without us, the more we live in a society that grows in freedom. But if we have to turn around and have to have regulations outside to keep us from killing each other, which is what Thomas Hobbes warns against, then what happens is that we don't live in freedom, we have to live under a law. And the more in our society today, especially here in the United States, we reject religion, the more we find these laws coming in that define our every single move. That's why we have such a thing as a nanny state. Because when we reject the religion, then all of a sudden the law has to come in and define everything we do. This is a principle that Paul discovered, and you find that written in Romans, where he said, the more you embrace Christ, the less you need to live under the law. If you reject Christ, your only solution is the law. And he said, the law will never save you. Only in Christ will you be saved. And so we look at that, and that's what he's talking about. It's not necessarily meaning that unless you're a Christian, you will never see heaven. That actually is not Catholic teaching. But what it does mean is that we experience Christ, and in Christ we find his freedom. If we reject Christ as Catholics, then our only solution is to live in this other environment where what drives us comes from the outside, not from the inside. And that's ultimately leads to tyranny, whereas the more we embrace Christ, we find freedom. Peter, on the same line, also teaches that we find love, which is what Paul led us to, but we find love in a way that we start with faith and we build upon our faith by living virtue, by growing in knowledge, by growing in self-control, until the final step is that we become people of love, but it begins with faith and it grows from that point. Together, they teach us two important things. That you and I are called to be people who live in love, build on our faith, and in doing so, we become people who live more and more in freedom, even if the society around us decides to live more and more under the law. So he's calling us to live in the freedom of the gospel, and in doing so, we're actually living in a way that the law doesn't fully apply to us because the law is a lower standard. We're living at a higher standard. So, for example, there is no law that applies to us that we'd have to worry about if we're living the standard of Christ, because we're living above the law. If, for example, you consider this, if it is the law of love that we do not want to hurt someone, so we choose out of the law of love to stop at a red light, then the law that says that we have to stop at a red light doesn't apply to us because we're going to do it anyway. That's really one of the principles that you're going to find out of Peter and Paul. Now, what he calls us, or what both of them call us to do, is to live this standard, and in doing so, we're living in a freedom, and kind of that a rising tide rises all boats. We do that in a way that also benefits society. But we begin by living the law of love. We don't begin by living a law that we enforce on others and ourselves, except for the law that says, as St. Paul would teach us, to love one another. These are the teachings of Peter and Paul, where they bring to us to come to know our faith in such a way that we grow in faith. But let's remember, they live their faith so powerfully that, as that saying goes, if it was illegal to be a Christian, would there be enough evidence to secure a conviction? And in the case of Peter and Paul, the answer is yes. What is the question that we can apply to ourselves? If it was illegal to be Christian here in the United States, and personally I believe it's not long before that is the case, then, in fact, will there be enough evidence to bring a conviction? And the question is something for us all to reflect upon, and the answer, hopefully, is yes. God bless you.